Okay, good afternoon everyone and welcome back. I hope you've had a lovely lunch. It's my great pleasure actually to introduce Professor Alison Park, who's going to chair this afternoon's panel. Alison is Deputy Executive Chair of the Economic and Social Research Council, the ESRC. Alison joined the ESRC as Director of Research in January 2019 and served as Interim Executive Chair between January 2021 and June 2023. So she's been at the top for quite some while. Prior to joining ESRC, Alison was Professor of Social Research and Director of the CLOSER, which is the Cohort and Longitudinal Studies Enhancement Resources, a significant ESRC-funded collaboration between University College London Social Research Institute. CLOSER brings together leading UK longitudinal studies, the British Library and the UK Data Service to maximise the use, value and impact of longitudinal studies. Much of Alison's career before joining UCL was spent at the NatSen Social Research entity, leading research teams that designed, implemented and analysed a wide range of government and academic studies, including some that you'll be very familiar with, Understanding Society and the British Social Attitudes Survey. It's my great pleasure to hand over to Alison to chair the afternoon session. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you so much, Judith, and welcome everybody to this afternoon session. Now, I know we all had a fantastic earlier session this morning, really reflecting on key insights from ongoing work within the ageing landscape, past and present. What we want to do with this session now is to really turn our thoughts to the future, aided by insights from an excellent panel who between them will bring with them a huge array of expertise in the area of ageing research. So we'll start the session off by, I'll ask each panelist to give a 2-minute reflection on their thoughts about the session this morning, covering one or more of the following questions. Their key take-home message from this morning, what they feel is missing in what we've been talking about in relation to ageing research that we need to think about for future funding calls, and from what they've heard, what they think the future direction of travel should look like. But before we do that, I'm conscious, firstly, that we have a couple of panel members who weren't with us this morning, and secondly, that not all of you will have been there this morning. So I'll give a really brief introduction to each panelist before I ask them for their 2-minute reflection. So without any further ado, I will start with Alan. So Alan Walker is a Professor of Social Policy and Social Gerontology at the University of Sheffield. So Alan, over to you for your 2-minute reflection.
Thank you very much indeed. So thinking in response to what's missing, very difficult to pinpoint something that's missing because we covered a very wide range. But I was struck by the issue that Carol raised towards the end of the discussion about the bridging of the different disciplines. And I suppose my personal reflection is that at the end of the New Dynamics of Aging programme, I was lulled into a false sense of security because I thought that there was some fusion across the disciplines, particularly between the biology and the social sciences. And I went so far as to label that the new science of aging, because I thought it had been created and wouldn't change. But I had a sense subsequently that the disciplines have rather retreated into their own disciplinary boxes. So I was quite heartened to hear that Carol was very positive, and Janet was too, about the extent of interdisciplinarity that is surviving through the networks, but also to see the extent of interdisciplinarity in the Healthy Aging Challenge. So maybe the jury is out on the extent to which there is the possibility of a greater fusion between biogerontology and social gerontology. I hope there can be. To secure it, based on previous experience, you have to have enthusiasm on both sides, no question about that. But you also need to have sustained and flexible funding, particularly from the UK research councils.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Alan. And I'm sure that's a topic, both of those issues you've raised are topics we'll come back to. I'll turn next to Chris Phillipson, who's Professor of Sociology and Social Gerontology at the University of Manchester. So over to you, Chris.
Yes, thanks, Alison. I mean, I think what I missed this morning was a stronger sense of the way in which wealth, income inequalities and social class are really driving the way ageing is shaped. It's a very striking figure in Chris Whitty's report, which shows that in the poorest areas, there's just 51 years of good life which people have, compared with 70 years of life, good aging, in the wealthiest areas. And that 20-year gap is the healthy aging challenge. And where we need major programs is to address that gap. Secondly, I think we need a major program to challenge what James Nasrou, my colleague in Manchester, has called the institutionalized racism of social research, where minority ethnic groups, and Janet did refer to them, minority ethnic groups have been excluded in the majority of population studies and really do not figure. Elderly, older people from African, Caribbean, Bangladeshi, Pakistani backgrounds do not figure. And yet we know that they have horrendous rates of poor health and poverty. Final point, I would kind of slightly challenge Janet here on the ambition of geroscience and longevity. I mean, to have longevity without social structures which can support longevity, which we don't have at the moment, would be a disaster. We're confused about the purpose of work. We're confused about the purpose of retirement. And we're confused about the purpose of what an aging society actually is. So I would challenge Janet and say that, Chris Whitty's report is important. It is not interdisciplinary. It does not have a space for social science. It does have a space for the aspiration to build longevity. But if you don't have social infrastructures which can support longevity, then that marvelous science will be dissipated. And I think that's the big worry that many of us have.
Thank you very much, Chris. Again, topics I'm sure we'll come back to. I'll move on now to Emily. So Emily Henderson is Associate Professor in Aging and Movement Disorders at the University of Bristol. So over to you, Emily.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. In the 2 minutes I have 3 main points. Just reflecting on what we heard this morning, I think there were very strong themes that emerged around transitioning to a sense of frailty rather than old age and senescence, that it's absolutely paramount, and this was one of the recurring themes, that research had to be interdisciplinary and collaborative, and we must engage with policymakers. And I think that really is true when we look at what is an ocean between gerontology and geriatric medicine at the moment. We need supported implementation, active dissemination. And I think Professor Lord gave us huge hope in terms of the potential for interventions to alter that life course. So the second aspect really is what do we bring potentially as academic geriatrics to this field? Well, I think we can act as bridges. We understand academia and clinical practice. We understand the culture of clinical practice, and we can bring some clinical credibility. And we really understand clinical complexity and uncertainty. And this is where I think our opinions, Professor Lord, may divide, because I think we are probably the least siloed ology of medicine. We really transverse all sorts of boundaries and borders and work already in a multidisciplinary team. I don't think that's necessarily reflected in our research practice. Multiple long-term conditions and frailty is core business for us in what we do as geriatricians. But I think my final point is just to reflect on, particularly in academic geriatric medicine, what we're missing. There are very few academic geriatricians if you compare us to the cardiologists, neurologists, endocrinologists, where doing a PhD is just par for the course of becoming a consultant. We need, therefore, more early career researchers, and research isn't core business for geriatric medicine. We're quite fragmented, we're small scale, and particularly pertinently, we're very weak in the area of drug trials. There is some hope on the horizon that we've seen in COVID, but we could have done so much better, particularly in the realms of things like care homes. And on top of that, not wanting to end on a particular downer, we have a really weak infrastructure to deliver clinical trials. And I think until we've tackled those areas, then it will be very difficult to advance the field.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Emily. I will move on now to Carol Holland. Carol is a professor in ageing at the University of Lancaster. So over to you, Carol.
Thank you. So I've got the same three questions, and it's quite good going later on in the order because you can respond a little bit to what my colleagues have said. So I think, I'd written down we really need to sort of continue to focus on this gap between healthy life expectancy and actual life expectancy. It's not about living longer, it's about living better in later life. But I think as well as thinking about that gap, we need to be aware that actually that gap starts a lot earlier for some people, as Chris has mentioned. So you might be thinking of frailty being something that affects people over 70 or over 80, but actually in some communities it's in people in their 40s. So we need to be thinking about how do we look at not just ageing as something in later life, but across the lifespan. But as well as thinking about compressing that morbidity, that gap, it's about, we need to also be thinking about it living well within the context, because inevitably, eventually, people do have health impairments. We're not talking about the medical side, we're talking about the living well and the support for to enable people to cope with and compensate for any deficits they might have, and support to do that when maybe other support structures have gone, like bereavement, for example. And then I think future directions, the sort of implementation and impact, support and development is absolutely crucial. If we're going to get all this, fantastic stuff, the technologies, the treatments, the interventions, and the knowledge that is accumulating and has accumulated, that we know quite a lot of stuff, and we're not as good as we should be at getting it implemented. So I think that's probably a good future direction to finish on.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Carol. And then finally, Janet Lord, who is Professor of Immune Cell Biology at the Institute of Inflammation and Ageing at the University of Birmingham. So over to you, Janet.
Yes, it's from this morning, I think what came across was really that we do need a multidisciplinary approach if we are going to deliver a healthy older population. So I'll come back at Chris's challenge to me and said, I hope I didn't give the impression that the answer is a pill. These biological processes are all influenced actually by our environment and by life. That increase in senescence can be down to increased stress, it can be down to inactivity, it can be down to some of it genetics. So it doesn't happen in isolation. And, if we, help that older person with poor lung function because their lung is full of senescent cells, if the senolytic helps them then to do exercise, that's no good if they're not able to exercise because of their poor built environment. So we really do need the two together, and I do not want to give the impression that it's all down to a pill. It certainly isn't. We have to tackle the environment of the older adult. But I think working together with geriatricians, with social scientists, with psychologists. I had a lovely conversation at lunchtime with a psychologist from Stirling. If we can, help people and find ways to motivate them to become more physically active, because there's a big psychological barrier there as well as perhaps a pain barrier due to arthritis. So we really need to work together. It's working together that will really ensure that old age is enjoyed and not endured. And I think the third point is hope. I think that's the thing. And I think I hope Emily might agree with me that a lot of the time an older person who is frail is just perhaps seen as a collection of diseases. There is little hope that we can do something about that. I think there is. I sort of get this feeling that old age, when it's going to be rubbish, isn't it? Well, it doesn't have to be. And I think if we can get that hope, get that across to the older adults, to the medical profession, to everybody really, that old age does not have to be really bad. It can be good if we can all work together.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Janet. I'm sure we would all agree with that. So at this point now, we can hand over to our sort of questions that we've received from you in the room and also from people watching us online. I've got a long list. I'm going to go with the ones that have been sort of upvoted by as many of you as possible. So do take a look if you've not looked at the questions on Slido. And I'll start off with a question by Paul Goulden. What are the panel's top tips for ensuring that ageing research translates into impact and change to policy and practice? So this is something I think all 5 of you have touched on in your answers. So your top tips for ensuring that the research that is being carried out now translates into impact and change. Alan, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. A very important question. And of course, there's no magic wand in terms of transforming research into positive social and economic change. Judith will murder me, but I'm going to say that the priority, if we want to address what Chris Whitty's report's shown, is actually not further research. It is transformational social policies. That is what's required, because we know why there are huge life expectancy and healthy life expectancy differences across the country, within localities, and within different social groups. We know there are massive structural barriers, but actually to address the social and commercial determinants of those inequalities, we know what they are, we know what creates them, and actually we know most of the policies that are required to turn around gradually across the life course those disgraceful inequalities, particularly in healthy life expectancy. In my city, between neighborhoods, there is a 20-year difference in healthy life expectancy. Between wards, just a half-hour bus ride from one side of the city to another, 10 years difference in healthy life expectancy and indeed life expectancy. So I don't think it's more research we need to address those major inequalities. The big question we have to ask is why, if we know the answers, we know the transformational change is necessary, and we've known it, frankly, for the last 2 decades, why aren't they being addressed? And that comes to a question that came up later. What explains the lack of transformational change, despite this massive amount of wonderful research that's been conducted? And you have to look at what the questioner called structural barriers. Barriers like ageism, like deeply embedded discrimination, like economism. So policymakers are all the time focusing not on individual or group well-being, but on narrow economic calculations about the worth of different groups to society. So, Judith, I do apologize, but I think we need to address those deep inequalities that Chris has pointed to, but I think we know how to do that.
Thank you, Alan. Carol, your reflections.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just add to what Alan's just said in terms of, we know a lot of this stuff. We've known it for quite a long time. We know, that improving certain aspects is going to have a long-term impact on healthy ageing. And I think the gap is sometimes the link between what we know and what people actually do, and what the politicians do, and what the policymakers do, and what even the local councils do, for example. So I think it's making those links, and that's where we need to be really focusing on. It's not just we learned quite a lot with the impact case study report that I looked at this morning, in terms of the huge effort and the huge amount of dedication that goes into having an impact with the research from the academic side. But maybe this is a sort of call for the businesses, for the policymakers, for the politicians to make the effort in the other direction, to learn what it is that the geriatricians know and the gerontologists know that could actually help develop this and get rid of some of these gaps that we're talking about.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that we do know all the answers. I mean, about inequalities, I think there are new inequalities, for example, which have come up over the past decade, partly through the interaction between the impact of COVID-19, cost of living crisis, and economic recession. And I think those have produced quite distinctive issues. I certainly don't think we know enough about inequalities facing minority ethnic groups. I mean, that simply isn't researched. And a quarter of ethnic minorities are living in deep poverty, despite being only 15% of the population. We don't know enough about that, or about the very complex health issues of those groups. I mean, I think one response to this is to try and set up demonstration research projects in local areas, working with local authorities, working with integrated health boards, working with housing associations, working with older people, bringing those actors, stakeholders together to confront inequality. And that's something that I think we should be trying to do, get funding through different partners. And I think that would perhaps bring out some of these questions. But I do think there are some new troubling forms of inequality which have emerged over the past decade, and I think that's worthy of a major research programme.
Lovely, thank you very much, Chris. Janet.
Yes. I guess I've been thinking about listening to everybody. I think there are a couple of things. So I think one is communication. I think improved communication to policymakers, but to older adults themselves. I know working in Birmingham with various groups, it's just, don't simply tell somebody to be more active or eat, different foods and keep their body weight down. I think if people understand why that works, because we know that works. So for 2-3 days, we know that the route is a good diet and physical activity. It's not rocket science. But communicating why that is, I think, helps people to understand. And the second thing is, I think one area, and I'd agree with Chris on this, is research into the biology of why different ethnicities have problems. Because yes, it's down to economics and the rest of it, but we've done studies looking at chronic diseases like arthritis, and these occur at least 10 years earlier in people from ethnic minorities. When you've ruled out everything else, economic disparities, everything else, the ethnic minorities develop diseases at different ages. That tells you there's something biologically different, and we don't understand that. When it comes to diet, we know that the Mediterranean diet works again, but that's not appropriate for all ethnic communities. Why don't we research the equivalent of a Mediterranean diet that's acceptable in different minorities? It must be there, but we don't do that. So yes, I think there is some more research required, but perhaps not in where you might expect.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Janet. And finally, Emily.
Thank you. I concur that I think if we were to be able to tackle the inequalities that many of the other speakers have alluded to, that would be the biggest win. And therefore we mustn't detract from that as a priority. That having been said, we are going to inherit older people in gerontology and in geriatric medicine, and they are going to come as they are. And in fact, it's helpful, I think, often to reflect that we are all apprentice older people. And I think with the best communities and housing and support, we can't have people just living with hundreds of different diseases. And it is sage to remember that A lot of these diseases are preventable, treatable, and amenable, including frailty, which is often forgotten, the fact that frailty is indeed reversible and treatable. And therefore, if we just look at some of the major achievements in cardiovascular medicine and stroke, there's no reason we can't achieve that in medicine. But I think we are right that we do need to establish better, more collaborative partnerships with gerontological research in order to achieve some of these aims. My final point is that I think we have a long way to go to really align research with what matters to older people. And that's potentially because a lot of the older people who participate in steering, or co-design is the new term, isn't it, research, are actually white, highly educated, middle-class retirees. And that has been demonstrated this morning. And they have a very valuable perspective, but we're not actually reaching the people who ultimately I think we all concur we're trying to target.
Excellent. Many thanks, Emily. So the next question is from Anna Talbot, and it is, how does innovation fit in with this? So I'm going to sort of broaden that out slightly, but I think what Anna's asking about is, in terms of the sort of work that you're doing, how does that connect with people who are trying to do that innovative new activity on the ground? Is there anyone on the panel who'd like to start us off in thinking about that? Chris, I don't know whether that connects to that.
What was the question?
How does innovation fit with what you're talking about?
How can
Innovation.
How can innovation?
How does innovation fit?
How does innovation fit? Yeah, well, I think one of the challenges we have is that trying to define aging societies at the present time is really incredibly difficult because of the diversity, because of the range of attitudes, range of experiences that it conveys. So I do think that having a very open approach in science, practice, and activities of all kinds is really important. And I think the groundwork has changed here to some extent. I think the sort of approaches that we had a few years ago, which were much more rigid, I think, as Alan was talking about, have changed. But I think there's still a bit of catch-up. If you like, Matilda Riley, who talked about the idea of structural lag, and her idea was that populations tended to run ahead of how society understood those populations, how they changed in terms of their cultures, how they changed in terms of their attitudes. I mean, she talked about that some 20 years ago, but I still think we're in a situation of structural lag to some extent. We have demographic aging, but our social structures, our culture is preparing us for a different kind of society, not for a long-lived society. And that, I think, is still a big challenge, where innovation has to come in to bridge the gap, if you like, between the two.
Thank you. Do any other members of the panel want to pick up that point? Alan?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Chris has said. And for me, in talking to and trying to influence policymakers locally and nationally, it's trying to get them to make the transition from older people to aging. And the simple fact is, when I talk about aging to policymakers, politicians, as I say, local or national, they're immediately thinking older people. And I'm saying aging because you age across the whole life course. And the outcomes, how people experience old age, are the outcomes of life course experiences from childhood. So we can connect poverty among children to coronary heart disease in early old age through the cohort studies. They're inextricably linked. So if we want to improve the outcomes for older people, we have to do something about the life course. That means, so where is the education for our children that they have the prospect of a 100-year life? That would transform thinking about the future and the preparation they need to make. To what extent does any employer small or large, focus on the well-being of his or her workforce, and therefore the prospects for future life. On the whole, very, very little. So the innovation question, I think, is really important. We need policy innovation, we need practical innovation, but for me, the focus would be on aging and less on old age.
Thank you. Janet.
I guess I'd just come back. I think that's, again, great. And I would come perhaps on the innovation side, think of the technical innovation. If there was something that could tell an individual where they were on that trajectory, I think that would be useful feedback, because I think, you know, as individuals, if somebody tells us, actually, you're 10 years older biologically than you think you are chronologically, perhaps that might be then the wake-up call, that, you know, some sort of feedback mechanism. So I think the innovation come with a simple, cheap test that people could take. And I know there are people at Loughborough developing a breath-based test, which would, you know, be even more accessible than the saliva one. So I think that's where innovation could come in, is something, a simple cheap way of knowing how well you're doing, which trajectory you're on.
Excellent. Thank you, Carol.
Yeah, I was just going to respond a little bit to Janet and also Chris's points in terms of the appetite for innovation. And I think there's a lot of sort of stereotypes that if you're older, then that you're less keen on adopting certain technologies. And I know that there is there is still people who are digitally excluded, so people maybe in their 80s and 90s who've never really used much technology in terms of computers and smartphones and that kind of thing. But I think that's completely changing. So I think, you know, some of the studies that we're doing, we've done some studies on VR or on other kind of independence supports in the home. People are really quite keen on them. So this sort of assumption that it won't be adopted is kind of going, but if they're designed with people who are going to be using them, then I think that's going to make a big difference, because people are, you know, really quite enthusiastic about these things. We did a VR study, and people were, you know, I've never had people sign up for a study so quickly because people wanted to have a go. So, you know, it is changing, and I think, you know, the sort of attitudes to technology is changing. So I think that's quite important to bear in mind.
Thank you. And I think there's some really good examples of that actually within the Healthy Aging Challenge, of just not having this stereotypical view about older people and what sort of technology they want to work with. So moving on, the next question takes us back to why we're here in the Healthy Aging Challenge. That is coming to an end in March next year. And so the question is, where do we go next? And to some extent, that's what I think all of you have been really helpfully providing your insights on. But the question is, who should we be consulting to inform that agenda of where we go next, and the funding for future research partnerships? So you've already mentioned, I think all of you, in your initial reflections, your thoughts on who some of the key groups are that we need to be engaging with. But who do you think are the sort of most important stakeholders, I suppose, who we should be talking to about where we go next? Emily, can I start with you?
I'm not sure if I'm necessarily positioned to give an exhaustive list, but I'm just conscious of maybe two groups that we haven't spoken about or articulated explicitly. One is public health, because we've talked extensively about inequality, and this is bread and butter and core business for public health, and I think it would be a failing not to engage with them. And the second, much as I can provide lots of cynical perspective on yet another app, is health psychology, actually. And I think we need to be mindful, so this is slightly tangential to the question of a generational shift that is occurring, and that we are inheriting a generation who will have grown up with smartphones, smartwatches, Apple rings of physical activity, who will be very fundamentally different from the older people that we serve at the moment. And I think we need to harness that. I would say probably not with another app, but that's the cynic in me. But I think we need to reflect that generational shift as well. But those are two groups I think we haven't yet cited and we need to engage with.
Excellent. Any other reflections from the panel of sort of key groups we need to be engaging with that we haven't really talked about?
Well, I'd answer it in two different ways. One, in terms of disciplines, and as a sociologist, I'd say that my discipline of sociology needs to kind of invigorate itself in terms of studying aging. I think it was marginalized to some extent in the impact of COVID-19, where we found that epidemiology, public health, clinical sciences dominated, and sociology had a bad war in that respect. So I think sociology needs to kind of invigorate itself. Other disciplines need to come in. Social anthropology, very important discipline for understanding aging, communities, and so on. We don't hear much about social anthropology. So, let's have a discussion about the disciplines which should have a higher profile. And I certainly think that in terms of stakeholders, following the experience of COVID-19, I think it is important to keep coming back to that experience which had a seismic impact on many communities. I do think public health has been shown to have a crucial role, but a public health, I think, which is more empowering of older people. I mean, the problem with the public health we had during COVID was that it was top down. We need a public health which is genuinely engaging with low-income communities, with minority ethnic groups. I don't think we saw that under COVID. So I agree, a reformed public health, if you like, which is really preparing us for a very unstable, risky future.
Thank you, Chris. Any other reflections from the panel before we move on that one? Okay, so moving on, really interesting question about the future for ageing research in partnership with businesses. So I wonder if there's anyone on the panel who wants to kick us off on that. So trying to think about how, as researchers, we've partnered with businesses and where you see opportunities for sort of further development and work. Janet?
I'll make a start with this one. I think there are some areas where you can see businesses would perhaps become interested in ageing research very quickly. You could think, the nutritional area, certainly, the apps we've heard about. But in the area, I think, of pharmaceuticals, I think it's going to be very difficult. So how do you persuade an industry absolutely fixed on one disease, one drug, to move away and say, what about one intervention, one drug that will treat 4 or 5 drugs? That is not in their interest and not in their economic model. I think that's going to be a challenge.
Any other reflections on that one? And I don't know if any of you have...
Yeah, well, I suppose that there have been a lot of studies which have looked at the attitudes of business in terms of aging populations. And I think that, there is a slow change in that regard, and, better understanding of the way that the consumer market is changing. But I'm not clear that this is altogether in the benefit, to the benefit of older people. I mean, a lot of that intelligence is based, again, on the sort of stereotypes that Alan's talked about. And that's a worry, that if we're getting market reports which just reproduce traditional stereotypical images of older people, that seems to be incredibly unhelpful. So I think, bringing together the kind of research that we talked about this morning and insights which business people are looking after, I think is going to be incredibly important. But I don't think that's happening so much at the present time. But I think we ought to see that.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah. So I'll just come in there because I think one of the interesting things that I've observed when I've worked with businesses is sometimes the interest comes as in, I've got a new technology, or I've got this thing that I think might be useful for older people, or the other way around. They're starting with the challenge or the problem, and how to sort of put these two things together. And I think that's something that maybe developing our links with business long term, so that when they do have something that could be useful, they've already sort of understood a little bit about some of the challenges of ageing that we might be wanting to address. So thinking about the two different directions and the sort of development of those relationships and the understanding from both sides as to what we're trying to address, I think would be very useful.
Alan.
Yeah, I agree with much of that. I think there is a risk of seeing business as a monolith. Of course, there are many different kinds of businesses, and some of them are not just seeking simple profit making to move into the area of what's seen as the grey market. Some of them genuinely want to promote the well-being of older people and to develop it. But also under that label of business are those commercial companies that do harm. Their products do harm to people as they age through excessive sugar, salt, ultra-processed food. So under the label of business, there are some businesses that have dangerous, health-harming behaviours that citizens, not older people in particular, citizens as a whole need protection from. But there are others that are much more progressive. I was talking to a young man over lunch, and he runs a social enterprise, as it happens in Sheffield, that is working with care homes to improve the physical functioning and, as a spin-off, the mental health of frail and dependent residents. It's absolutely marvelous. So there is a huge range of, quote, businesses, some of whom are progressive, forward-looking, and do have a bit of a handle on the aging population, if not totally. And others are simply in the business of profit. And even if that means that their products harm the health of people as they age.
Thank you. Really, really helpful comments. Sorry, did you want to come back in, Emily?
It's just a last comment. I think if we are to partner with business, we need to be internationally competitive to persuade businesses that are really at the forefront of improving ageing to work with us here in the UK and not go elsewhere. I think we need to be excellent, we need to be focused, and we need to have infrastructure. And I'm not sure if we've necessarily got that triad together at the moment to remain internationally competitive.
Thank you. Chris?
Well, there is another side to the discussion about urging businesses to employ people in conditions which are giving people, which promote health within the workplace, which is the subject, of course, of programs in the Healthy Aging Challenge program. I mean, there was an extraordinary article, which some of you may have seen in The Observer a week ago, which had Jeff Bezos of Amazon talking about his role in promoting longevity, his longevity research. My response was, yes, but he's employing workers in conditions which will reduce their lives. And I think we need to call out businesses which which employ people on 0 hours contracts in conditions which will not extend their lives, will not extend healthy life expectancy. And I think this is an important area of research which we continue to need.
Excellent. Thank you very much, all. Really insightful comments. So completely different topic now. Lovely question here from Helen. I don't know if it's Helen Manchester or Helen in Manchester, but the question is, as we're talking about the future of ageing research, can you tell us about the work of an exciting early career researcher you work with or know of? Now, that might not apply to all of you here, but is there anyone on our panel who wants to share an example of work they know is being done in this field by an early career researcher that excites them?
Yeah, go on, I will. I work with quite a lot of early career researchers. So I have, I've talked about the PhD student who's working in VR. So she's looking at whether people develop a sense of place with VR, places within VR, and looking at VR travel, as it were, going for a walk or going up a mountain or going through a forest, and how that can, to some extent, replace the joy of being out in nature yourself once maybe you can't necessarily go for a walk yourself and you're a little bit more housebound. So I think that's quite exciting use of technology to fulfill a particular travel need that people might have or mobility need. So that's one example. I could go on, but I'll let other people talk about other ones.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carol. Anyone else? Emily?
No. Researchers and
No, you go.
Oh, right, yes, okay. Well, I'm delighted to be working with a great group of researchers in Manchester who are doing exciting work on issues around urban aging. And I think one of the challenges of population aging, Chris Whitt is right to point out issues in coastal and rural areas, but it's equally true that urban areas, cities, pose huge challenges for aging populations, and we have an exciting, strong group of early career researchers working on that area in Manchester, very much working with a range of stakeholders, including local authorities, and that's proved really inspirational, and with older people, looking at their attitudes towards working with us and trying to change the environments in which they live.
Thank you. Emily.
Thank you. I'd like to highlight the work actually of Emma Tennyson, particularly because she was my first ever PhD student. She's just completed, she's a trainee in geriatric medicine. And our clinical research is focused on Parkinson's disease, cognitive impairment and falls. And we recognised, and I think you could draw parallels with the vast majority of ageing research, that in Parkinson's, the majority of clinical studies and trials tend to recruit younger people with early disease onset, who are men, who are Caucasian, and who have very early disease without cognitive impairment. So she actually took a very real life sample of a population that was served under the umbrella of Parkinsonism, so just not conventional idiopathic disease, so captured many more people with dementia. But as part of this cross-sectional study, she proactively sought to enrol those who are often excluded from research trials, so those with dementia who had to be enrolled with a personal consultee. She actually showed that phenotypically there's a group of people that can still be reached, but it takes additional investment. They tend to be older, female, living in care homes. And they were able to take part in this cross-sectional study, but on average it took 6 to 8 additional telephone calls to reach, enroll them, and then have them take part. And I think what we can take from that is that we can say, if you're really serious about delivering interventions and clinical studies in these populations, it's going to require increased investment in order to provide that additional capacity that's needed to recruit people to clinical trials.
Fantastic. Thank you. Janet, did you want to come in?
Yes. So I've been working with a lovely early career researcher, and she's very interested in how diet influences immune function. Again, a lot of it came out of the COVID situation. And what she's doing is she's analysing the microbiome in the gut, so looking at stool samples. It's not the most glamorous of work. Finding out what bacteria are in those who have a good response to the COVID vaccine and those who have perhaps not so quite a good response. But then she's taking that further and working with industry to then develop a probiotic nutrient that could be given to actually restore the microbiome in patients, particularly those who are in hospital. They've got antibiotics, so their microbiome's shot. But then she's also working with different ethnic communities in Birmingham to look at their microbiota as well. So really taking a broad approach to how nutrition can really help you have a good old age.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Janet. Alan.
Yeah, it's a very nice question, and I'm sure all of my colleagues feel the same, that working with early career researchers is perhaps the most rewarding aspect of everything we do, to see careers developing, being established, and then developing further. At the moment, I'm working with a number of students from China, other parts of East Asia. For example, the first study of older women in Thailand, which is looking at the highly patriarchal society, looking at their situation in rural areas and in urban areas. And also a Chinese student looking at how to apply Western policies of active aging to very different and challenging concepts of China, which is experiencing incredibly rapid aging, 3 times as fast, for example, as the UK aged. If you classify aging as moving from 7% of the population aged 65 and over to 14%. Remarkable young people who are absolutely committed to developing social policies in their own countries to improve the situation of older people. Thank you.
Excellent. And following on really nicely, actually, from that question, a question from Sadhana Jagannath. What is your top advice for early career researchers in driving the future of ageing research? So what would if you had one nugget of wisdom to give to early career researchers in this space, what would it be? Emily, I'm going to pick on you first, just because I've caught your eye.
Okay. I think you need a whole lot of skills, and those will be different for everybody. My one top tip is to be tenacious. You don't need to be the best. You just need to stick at it and want to do it. And I think tenacity is often, along with integrity, the two go together, so I'm going to have two. Tenacity and integrity. Just stick with those two and stick at it.
Wonderful. Janet, any reflections from you?
Oh, gosh, it's a tough one, isn't it? It's similar to Emily. I would stick at it, but I would say to try and think outside the box. And I think when I came into ageing research all those years ago with SAGE, Alan, that you mentioned, the BBSRC grant, they wanted people to come in who had not been involved in ageing research. And so I had to talk to lots of people and find out, what were the issues, what mattered to older people, and where were the gaps. So I think, think outside of the box and talk to people outside of your discipline.
Chris?
I think I'm probably with Emily here. It's all hard work. I think looking back over my career, it's only been hard work. No, I have been inspired a lot by, great researchers I've met along the way. But in between, it's hard work.
Yeah, I was going to say resilience, actually. I think, but that's the same for any research career in terms of not giving up at your first paper rejection or anything like that, because we all have plenty of those. But I was also going to say, get yourself embedded in ageing. Don't just go to the talks that are relevant to your particular piece of research when you're at a conference. Listen to what else is going on. Listen to older people, observe older people when you sat on the bus. Just get really embedded so that you start to really understand what's going on in the research area, but also as people are getting older themselves as well. Talk to your grandparents sometimes is as a basic recommendation.
Brilliant. Alan?
Yeah, I agree with all of those excellent suggestions. So I would say beyond research, it's having a commitment to social change that I think is really crucial. Some way of contextualizing the sorts of transformations that are required. And they are, as Chris indicated, massive transformations that are required. So having a broader commitment to social change that will encourage you to take part in impact-related activities to try to translate the results of research into something that will have an impact on people as they age or once they've aged.
Excellent. We've got time for one more question. So I'm going to finish with, if you could speak succinct in your response, but what is the one thing you would wish to say to funders and or politicians in relation to the sort of topic that we're here for today? Alan, do you want to kick us off?
No, sure. Happily. I'd say to the funders, please go on sustaining funding, because just that review I gave you of the development of ageing research support over the last 3 or 4 decades indicates that sustained funding makes a difference. And so if you embed in that the commitment to multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity, I think that's really important. If I had one message for policymakers, it's the one I mentioned earlier. Please think about aging across the life course and not just old age.
Thank you. Carol?
Yeah, and I'd add to what Alan just said by saying make sure that there is continued funding for impact support and implementation support. I'll stop there.
Chris?
I would just stress the responsibility of universities, actually, and also the importance of those universities who can, funding interdisciplinary research centres, because I don't think we're going to make the kind of progress on interdisciplinary research unless some of our universities take a stronger leadership role in funding centres, bringing researchers together within their own institution. And there isn't enough of that being done. So I would make a plea for that, that universities have got to step up for the mark and take a stronger role in supporting interdisciplinary work if it's going to get off the ground.
Janet.
I think I would, my plea would be to try to focus on really translating what we already know. I think, we really know a lot about how to achieve old age, but getting there, so really impact again, really focusing on delivering what we know works already. And linked to that, I think, and it was in the House of Lords report, better coordination of what's happening in ageing research across the UK, integrating the work of the social scientists with the biologists. I think that's really still not happening, and that's a big thing that we're missing. And perhaps the US get ahead of us because they've got a National Institute on Aging. We haven't got the equivalent, but we need somebody coordinating what we're doing, I think.
Emily.
I'd have 2 points. My first would be that ageing for us all in this room is a passion. But I think for funders, we have to go back and say ageing matters because it's about your future, your personal future. And if you invest in research, you are investing in the population and yourselves. And that may be a driver. And the second thing is I think that they have a strong role to play in equity around some of the disadvantages that we've spoken at great length in terms of socioeconomics, racial bias, inclusion, ageism, the last acceptableism.
Wonderful. So thank you so much to the entire panel for what personally I've found an incredibly insightful and inspiring set of conversations. We've got through a lot. There's a huge array of questions that we've not managed to answer, so apologies to those of you whose questions I haven't asked at. If we could all join me in thanking our panel. And then I'm just asked to remind you that after the break is the big conversation of the future of ageing, where you can give us some further ideas and sort of reflections on this session now. And there's drinks and nibbles after that, I'm told. So many thanks to all of you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day here. Thank you.